Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
There are moments in television history that don't just change a single show, they redefine what an entire era of entertainment means and whether it has any place in the future. For decades, Benny Hill was Britain's court jester, a man whose rubbery face, impish charm, and gift for physical comedy made him one of the most recognizable entertainers on the planet. His show aired in over 140 countries. His theme music was hummed by people who had never even visited England. Children laughed at him. Grandparents laughed at him. Prime ministers probably laughed at him when no one was watching. But fame, no matter how enormous, is never immune to time. And for Benny Hill, time came collecting in the late 1980s, not slowly or gently, but with the force of a cultural earthquake. A show that had survived decades of changing tastes, rival networks, and shifting social attitudes finally met its match. What brought it down wasn't low ratings alone, wasn't one single villain, and wasn't even a clean, simple scandal. It was something messier and more complicated, a collision between a comedian who refused to change and a world that had changed completely around him. So what exactly happened? What was the scene, or series of moments, that finally pushed Thames Television to pull the plug on one of its most profitable properties? And why did a man beloved by millions end up spending his final years feeling abandoned by the very industry he had given his life to? That's the story we're telling today. To understand the fall, you have to first appreciate the height from which Benny Hill fell. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, the name his parents gave him in Southampton in 1924, had clawed his way up from a working-class background through sheer determination and an almost supernatural instinct for making people laugh. He had worked as a milkman, a truck driver, a drummer, and a department store assistant before finding his footing in entertainment. His grandfather had been a circus clown, and somewhere in the bloodline, the gift for performance had been passed down and refined into something altogether more ambitious. When the Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC on January 15, 1955, it arrived at exactly the right moment. Television was new, audiences were hungry, and Hill's particular brand of humor, fast-paced slapstick, double entendres, parody, and visual gag work, was perfectly suited to the medium. He could do things on television that stage comedians could never pull off. He could control the camera, use editing as a comedic tool, and craft sketches with the precision of a watchmaker. By 1969, when the show moved from the BBC to Thames Television, Hill had already established himself as a national institution. But the move to Thames unlocked something even bigger. The format shifted to one-hour specials, giving Hill more room to build elaborate productions. The results were extraordinary. By 1971, the show was pulling in over 21 million viewers, an almost incomprehensible number by today's standards. Thames Television exported the show globally, and it landed in the United States with surprising force, earning Emmy Award nominations in 1980 and 1981. Hill won a BAFTA for Best Writer in 1972 and a Rose d'Or in 1984. He was, by every measurable standard, a titan. But even during the glory years, the seeds of the show's eventual downfall were being quietly planted. The Benny Hill Show had always featured women prominently, and not always in ways that aged well. The format leaned heavily on the idea of attractive young women as comic props. Hill's famous run-off chase sequences, filmed using undercranking techniques to create a sped-up, frenetic visual effect, almost always concluded with scantily clad women being pursued across fields, corridors, and car parks to the frantic beat of yakety sax. It was presented as harmless fun. For a long time, most viewers accepted it on those terms. Then came Hill's Angels. Introduced in the early 1980s, this was a dance troupe of young women who became a permanent fixture of the show. They performed choreographed routines, appeared in sketches, and served increasingly as visual decoration around Hill's comedy. Defenders of the show argue the Angels were talented performers given genuine screen time. Critics saw something different, a middle-aged man surrounding himself with young women in revealing costumes and using their bodies as the punchline to jokes that had grown stale and mean-spirited. The broader culture was shifting. The 1980s in Britain were a decade of intense political and social debate. Feminism had moved from the margins to the mainstream. Women in public life were speaking more loudly about how media representations shaped real-world attitudes and behaviors. Television executives, advertisers, and commissioning editors were beginning to pay attention in ways they hadn't before. The question being asked about shows like Benny Hill's was no longer simply, is it funny? It was, what does this teach people? What does it normalize? Against this backdrop, a particular sketch aired in the late 1980s that crystallized every criticism that had been building for years. The scene featured Hill in a parody of a beauty pageant, a format that was itself already growing controversial in mainstream culture. In the sketch, women were paraded, evaluated, and reduced entirely to their physical appearance. The humor derived not from clever writing or subversive observation but from simple, straightforward objectification. The women existed in the sketch as objects to be ogled, measured, and commented upon. There was no satirical distance. There was no twist. The joke was the objectification itself. By the standards of what British television had previously allowed, the sketch wasn't shocking in a graphic sense. But it landed in a cultural moment when people were looking at this kind of content differently. What might have sailed past unnoticed in 1972 now felt like a deliberate provocation, or, perhaps worse, like a comedian who genuinely didn't understand why anyone might object. The complaints came, and they were louder than anything the show had faced before. The sketch became a focal point for everyone who had been building a case against the show. It wasn't just that one scene was offensive in isolation. It was that the scene seemed to represent something about where Benny Hill had ended up as a comedian, locked in a vision of the world that had become increasingly difficult to defend. The most high-profile attack came from comedian Ben Elton, a rising star of the alternative comedy movement that had been deliberately positioning itself as the antidote to the old-school humor represented by Hill. Elton was sharp, political, and deeply connected to the feminist debates of the 1980s. He made a series of public statements, including on the television program Saturday Live and in the January 1987 issue of Q magazine, in which he accused the Benny Hill show of actively contributing to a culture of harassment and violence against women. Elton's argument was provocative and direct. He claimed that shows depicting women as perpetual objects of male pursuit helped create an atmosphere in which women felt unsafe in public spaces. He connected the dots between media representation and real-world harm in a way that was unfamiliar and uncomfortable for many in the entertainment industry. The response was fierce and divided. Supporters of Hill found Elton's accusations absurd and disproportionate. A writer in The Independent described the attack as resembling the spectacle of someone kicking an elderly relative, gratuitous and cruel toward a man whose humor, whatever its faults, came from a gentler era. GQ magazine mocked the logic of blaming a television comedian for social problems, arguing that one might as well blame concert pianists for unrelated crimes in the world. The comparison struck many as reaching, even desperate. And yet Elton's words stuck. Not because everyone agreed with him, but because he had articulated something that a significant portion of the audience, particularly younger viewers and women, had already been feeling without quite having the language for it. The Broadcasting Standards Council weighed in, with a spokesperson acknowledging that public tolerance for certain kinds of humor had genuinely shifted. Content that once seemed playful now seemed to many viewers like something darker. Elton himself would later revisit this moment with enough self-awareness to parody his own position. In the comedy series Harry Enfield and Chums, a sketch featured a character called Benny Elton, a caricature of Elton as a joyless enforcer of political correctness, who ends up being chased by angry women to the tune of yakety sax. It was a sharp piece of self-mockery that acknowledged the debate had been messy and complicated on all sides. The public controversy fed into conversations that were already happening inside Thames Television. By the late 1980s, the economics of the show had become harder to justify. Each episode was costing approximately £450,000 to produce, equivalent to well over £1 million in today's money. That figure had been sustainable when the show was delivering 20 million viewers and commanding premium advertising rates. As viewership declined through the mid to late 1980s, the math started to look very different. The cultural controversy made the financial argument easier to act on. Thames Television found itself in the position of defending an expensive show that was generating negative headlines and declining audiences simultaneously. The case for renewal grew weaker with every season. In 1989, Thames made the decision to cancel the Benny Hill show after 21 years of production. What made the cancellation particularly painful for Hill was the manner in which it apparently happened. By most accounts, Hill was not given a gradual wind-down or an opportunity to say goodbye to his audience on his own terms. The show simply ended. For a man who had given Thames Television an estimated £26 million in revenue, much of it generated by American syndication, the abruptness felt like a betrayal. Hill's friend and director Dennis Kirkland would later describe the cancellation as having devastated Hill personally in ways that never fully healed. Hill had built his identity entirely around his work. He had no family of his own, having never married despite proposing to 2 women who both declined. He lived alone in a rented flat in Teddington, maintaining the frugal habits of his working-class upbringing even as a wealthy man. The show had not just been his career. It had been his life. After the cancellation, Hill attempted to rebuild. In 1991, he began work on a project called Benny Hill's World Tour, which was intended to bring his comedy to the international audiences who still adored him. The plan involved filming specials in locations around the world where the original show had been particularly popular. But the project struggled to gain momentum, and Hill only completed a single episode, a special filmed in New York titled Greetings from New York, which featured familiar faces from the old cast including Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton. It would later be described as his final television appearance. Meanwhile, in February 1992, Thames Television, responding to sustained pressure from viewers who missed the show, began re-airing re-edit episodes. The decision revealed something important: the cancellation had not killed the audience's affection for Hill. Millions of people still wanted to see his work. The question of whether the show had been genuinely harmful or simply uncomfortable for an industry undergoing a values shift was still unresolved in the minds of many ordinary viewers. But Benny Hill himself never got to see where that conversation landed. On April 20, 1992, he was found dead in his armchair in his Teddington flat, having passed away while watching television. He was 68 years old. The cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis. He had refused a heart bypass surgery recommended after a mild heart attack the previous February, and had also declined kidney dialysis treatment after a subsequent diagnosis of kidney failure. On the same day he died, a new television contract arrived from Central Independent Television, a painful final irony that seemed to encapsulate everything about the timing of his downfall.